I bought my dream home, a beautiful house on a peaceful street, thinking I had escaped the nightmare of HOAs forever. No more ridiculous fines, no more power-hungry board members knocking on my door. But one day, a letter arrived. A fine? For what? I wasn't even in an HOA. At least, that's what I thought. Moving into my new house was supposed to be stress-free. I did my research, checked all the paperwork, and confirmed that my property was not part of an HOA. That was one of the reasons I bought it. So when I got a letter demanding I cut my grass to a certain length and repaint my mailbox, I laughed it off. Mistakes happen, right? I ignored it. Then came another letter. This time, it wasn't so friendly. A fine of $100 for non-compliance. I checked the sender. Some HOA I had never heard of. Confused, I called the number on the letter. "Hello, I think there's been a mistake. I don't belong to your HOA." The woman on the other end scoffed. "If you live in this neighborhood, you follow the HOA rules." I argued, I explained, but she wouldn't listen. Instead, she told me the fines would continue until I complied. Then she hung up on me. Now, I don't like being bullied. So I dug into my property records. Everything confirmed what I already knew. My house was not under HOA jurisdiction. The previous owner had even fought to keep it that way. I thought that was the end of it. Then came the third letter. The fine had jumped to $500. And now they were threatening a lien on my home. That's when I knew these people weren't going to back down. I decided to meet the HOA board in person. Big mistake. When I showed up at the meeting, the president, a smug guy in his 50s named Richard, smiled like he had already won. "Ah, Mr. No Rules. Finally decided to follow the community standards." I put my paperwork on the table. "I don't belong to this HOA. Stop sending me fines." Richard barely glanced at the documents before sliding them back. All homes in this area must follow HOA guidelines. If you refuse, we'll escalate the matter legally. That's when the real threat came. Another board member, a woman with a sharp voice, leaned in and whispered, "We've dealt with stubborn homeowners before. You might find life very difficult here if you keep resisting." What did she mean by that? The next morning, I woke up to my trash bins missing. Then, I noticed my mailbox was mysteriously knocked over. A few days later, I found a warning on my door. Something about my fence being in violation and needing removal. These people weren't just trying to fine me, they were harassing me. I had two choices: cave in and start obeying rules that didn't apply to me, or fight back. What would you do? Let them win or teach them a lesson? Because I knew exactly what I was going to do. I wasn't going to let a bunch of HOA bullies push me around. They picked the wrong guy to mess with. First, I needed proof of their harassment. So I installed security cameras around my house. If they wanted to mess with me, I'd catch them in the act. A few days later, my sprinklers mysteriously stopped working. I checked the footage. Guess what? 2 HOA board members snuck onto my lawn at 2 a.m. and shut off my water valve. That was all the confirmation I needed. These people weren't just overstepping. They were actively breaking the law. Compiled the footage, emails, and all the letters they sent me. Then I called a real estate attorney. He took one look at my paperwork and grinned. "They have no legal standing over your property. If they keep this up, they're in serious trouble." That's when I decided to hit them where it hurt. First, I sent a cease and desist letter through my attorney. The letter stated that since my house was not legally under HOA jurisdiction, any further harassment would result in a lawsuit for fraud and harassment. I thought that would be enough to make them back off. I was wrong. A few days later, I got a summons to small claims court. The HOA was suing me for unpaid fines. I couldn't believe it. These people were so desperate for control that they were willing to take me to court, without any actual legal authority over my home. Fine. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one. On the day of the hearing, I walked into court fully prepared. The HOA president, Richard, sat across from me, looking smug. He actually thought he had already won. The judge asked the HOA to present their case. Richard confidently handed over a stack of HOA bylaws. The judge flipped through them, then looked at Richard. "Where is the signed agreement from the homeowner?" Richard shifted in his seat. "Well, he lives in the neighborhood, so—" The judge cut him off. "That's not how HOAs work. If he never signed a contract agreeing to your HOA's rules, you have no authority over his property." Richard turned, red. "But all homes in the area, are you saying he signed an HOA agreement?" Silence. The judge turned to me. "Sir, do you have proof that your property is not part of the HOA?" I handed over my documents. The judge reviewed them, nodded, then turned back to Richard. "This case is dismissed, and I'd be very careful about pursuing this matter further. You're bordering on fraud." Richard looked like he wanted to explode, but I wasn't done yet. Now that the HOA had lost, I had the perfect opportunity to turn the tables. Winning in court was satisfying, but I knew the HOA wouldn't give up that easily. These people were petty, and something told me this went deeper than just a few fines. So, I started digging. First, I requested public records on the HOA. Since they had taken me to court, I had every right to investigate their finances and policies. I also spoke to a few of my neighbors, ones who had actually signed up for the HOA. What I found was shocking. Richard, the HOA president, wasn't just enforcing rules, he was profiting off them. Here's how. Every time the HOA issued a fine, a portion of the money went into a maintenance fund. But instead of using that money for the neighborhood, Richard and his board were paying themselves hefty salaries, and it got worse. I found multiple instances of fraudulent liens. They had done this to at least 3 other homeowners, people who, like me, had no legal ties to the HOA but had been bullied into paying fines just to avoid legal trouble. They had already forced one homeowner to sell their house when they refused to pay. The HOA then bought the property at a discount and sold it for a massive profit. This wasn't just about control. This was a scam. Armed with this new information, I decided it was time for real revenge. First, I shared everything with my attorney. He immediately saw the legal violations: fraud, embezzlement, wrongful liens. The HOA had opened itself up to serious lawsuits. Then, I took my findings to the local news. Nothing gets results faster than bad publicity. I sent them all the evidence, including videos of their harassment, the fraudulent fines, and even testimony from neighbors. The reporters ate it up. Within a week, an expose aired on TV showing how the HOA had been extorting homeowners. Interviews with past victims painted Richard as a greedy, power-hungry scam artist. And guess who saw the report? The state attorney general. The next thing I knew, an official investigation was launched. The HOA was forced to open their financial records, and guess what? They had hundreds of thousands of dollars in misallocated funds. Translation: they were stealing from homeowners. That's when the real panic set in. Richard tried to blame everything on the treasurer, but that excuse didn't hold up. Within days, subpoenas were issued. The entire HOA board was under official investigation for fraud. And, just like that, the tables had turned. Richard and his cronies had spent months harassing me, thinking they were untouchable. Now, they were the ones facing serious legal trouble. But I wasn't done watching them squirm just yet. Richard and his HOA goons thought they were untouchable. For years, they bullied homeowners, stole money, and forced people out of their homes for profit. But now, they were cornered. The investigation wasn't just serious, it was devastating. Auditors found over $300,000 in misallocated funds. Richard had been paying himself a salary, which, by the way, was completely illegal since HOA boards are supposed to be voluntary positions. The treasurer? He had been writing fake invoices for maintenance work that never happened and then cashing the checks. Worst of all, they found fraudulent liens placed on multiple properties, proving the HOA had been forcing people out of their homes to make a profit. And the homeowners? They were furious. The same people who once feared Richard were now lining up to sue him. Some had lost thousands in bogus fines. Others had nearly lost their homes. The neighborhood turned against him overnight. And then came the emergency HOA meeting. Richard must have thought he could talk his way out of it, because he actually showed up. He sat at the front of the room, sweating under the fluorescent lights, while a packed crowd of furious homeowners glared at him. One by one, people stood up to speak. A man who had paid over $10,000 in fake fines. A single mother whose house was nearly taken from her. An elderly couple who had been harassed for years. The anger in the room was palpable. And then, the final blow. An investigator stood up and read the charges against the HOA board. Fraud, embezzlement, harassment. The list went on. When Richard tried to defend himself, people booed. Then someone shouted, "We vote to remove the entire board!" Cheers erupted. One by one, the board members were voted out. Richard tried to object, but it was too late. His power was gone. And just when I thought the night couldn't get better, two uniformed officers walked in. Richard turned pale. The officers approached, handcuffs ready. He was being arrested. I swear, the moment they snapped those cuffs on his wrists, the entire room erupted into applause. As Richard was led out, he spotted me in the crowd. His face twisted in anger, like he knew I was the one who started all this. And he was right. I just smiled. By the time the dust settled, Richard and the treasurer were charged with multiple felonies. The HOA was completely dissolved, and all the bogus fines and liens were erased. And me? I finally got to enjoy my house without HOA harassment. But tell me, what do you think Richard is doing now? Sitting in a jail cell, still thinking he's in charge? With the HOA dissolved and Richard facing serious charges, life in the neighborhood completely changed. For the first time in years, homeowners weren't living in fear of fines, threats, or ridiculous rules. People finally painted their houses whatever color they wanted. One guy put up a huge flag in his yard just because he could. Someone else installed a giant flamingo statue just to spite the old HOA restrictions. It was like the whole neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. But the best part? Watching Richard's downfall. His fraud charges weren't small. The court found that he had embezzled over $150,000 from the HOA. That meant jail time. His treasurer buddy got off with probation. But Richard? He wasn't so lucky. When the sentencing day arrived, I showed up just to see it happen. Richard sat there looking miserable. He had gone from a smug HOA dictator to a broken man in a cheap suit. The judge didn't go easy on him. For years, you abused your position to intimidate and steal from innocent homeowners, the judge said. You showed no remorse and even attempted to fraudulently seize properties that didn't belong to you. And then came the sentence. 5 years in prison, plus full restitution to every homeowner he had scammed. When the judge slammed the gavel, Richard looked like he was going to faint. And me? I just sat there, arms crossed, enjoying the justice, being served. But wait, it gets better. Because of the fraudulent liens, Richard was personally sued by multiple homeowners. Since he had spent most of the stolen money on himself, he had no way to pay them back. That meant one thing. He lost his own house. The same way he had tried to force others out of their homes, he was now being forced out of his. Poetic, right? And guess who showed up at the foreclosure auction? A group of very angry former HOA victims pooled their money together and bought Richard's house. What did they do with it? They turned it into a community clubhouse, open to everyone in the neighborhood, except, of course, Richard. Meanwhile, I finally got to enjoy my home without a single bogus fine. No more threats, no more harassment, no more HOA nonsense. And the best part? A few months later, I got a letter from Richard, from prison. It was some pathetic attempt at an apology, blaming the treasurer, blaming the system, blaming everyone, except himself. I didn't even bother responding, because in the end, Richard got exactly what he deserved. But tell me, do you think 5 years in prison was enough for someone like him? Or should he have gotten even more?